Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. We're really excited today to be talking with Gil Schaeffer. Gil has written several articles for the Democratic Constitution blog, including Democratic Political Movements, Democratic Electoral Rules, and Socialism, a reply to Daniel Lazare. He's also written The Democratic Constitution Strategy is the Blueprint for a New Party. That means voting for Democrats in 2024, even Biden. And finally, he's written Marxism Is Democratic Republicanism, the history of the struggle for equal human and political rights from the inside out. And today we're going to be talking mostly, I think, about the ideas brought up in that last article, because what we've been doing, and Gil has been participating in this with us, is going through a reader that folks in the blog, especially Gil, contributed to. The reader is called Equal Human and Political Rights and Democratic Republicanism. And right now we're about to start chapter 7. We've been going through each section of that reader. And I wanted to go through just the titles of the sections to give folks an idea of what the reader is. We talk about the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in section 1, section 2, the English Civil War and the Levelers, section 3, C.B. McPherson's criticism of the Levelers' possessive individualism, Are Democratic Rights Bourgeois? Is Democracy a Threat to Property? We then talk about the English Civil War and the American Revolution and the survival of Leveler egalitarianism, its revival in 1776, and its philosophical justification. We then have two sections on the sources of Marxist political thought. Part 1, we talk about the French Revolution, utopian socialism, Chartism, and Engels. In the second part, we talk about the American working men's parties, Marx, discussions of the egoism of democratic Republican rights, and slavery. We then talk about the classical Marxist minimum maximum program, followed by 3 sections on the tactics of democratic republicanism. The first one being Lenin on democratic consciousness, the second one being Republic and social democracy in France, and the third one being Luxembourg versus Kautsky and Franz Mehring in 1910. And then we finish off by talking about Party of a New Type, taking up that question, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the American Socialist Party and Communist Party, the Civil Rights, Black Liberation Movement, and the New Left. And then we end with a chapter on the reemergence of the demand for a democratic constitution. And then we actually read that last article I mentioned by Gil as a postscript. Marxism is democratic republicanism. So with all that out of the way, thanks, Gil, for coming on. And I wanted to ask about the reader. What are the reader's origins? What does the title mean to you?
Sure. Well, this all started from my involvement in the Marxist Unity Group's reading group. The Marxist Unity Group reader starts off with Lars Lee, a chapter from his book on the merger formula, which is that Marxism, social democracy, is the merger of socialism with the working class. Okay. And Lee in that, so Lee has the whole chapter is mainly Lee's construction of the narrative of the inevitability of socialism. Okay. We'll put that aside because Lee also in the chapter says it was Engels who invented the merger formula, that social democracy is the merger of socialism with the worker movement. Okay. And Engels did that in his Condition of the Working Class in England, which was written in German and only a German audience read it. But it was Engels' theoretical combination of the ongoing English workers' movement. And Engels thought that movement had to combine the theories of socialism, that it hadn't fully adopted it. Okay. Now, the problem comes in that the English workers' movement was not a trade union movement like the later German workers' movement. The English workers' movement was a demand for a democratic republic. It was Chartism. And Lee doesn't mention that. The democratic republic doesn't come up in Lee's study of Lenin. It doesn't come up in the merger formula. Okay, he doesn't mention it. And so what Engels was actually doing was combining democratic republicanism, which was a political movement, with the idea of socialism, of what a democratic workers' state would need to do to regulate the economy, to take control from capitalists. Okay, so Lee leaves that out. Even though the main demand of the Russian Social Democratic Party in its program was for a democratic republic. Again, Lee just leaves that completely out of his account. And so the problem with the mug reader is that it's as if history begins, that the democratic aspect of Marxism basically begins in the 1840s with Marx and Engels. And that simply isn't true. Marx and Engels did not invent the idea of democracy. They also didn't invent the idea of socialism. And so where did democracy come from? So in putting together kind of the reading list we're going through, I go back into English history with the Peasant Revolt of 1381, but primarily the levelers, that the modern idea of representative democracy was a creation and a demand of the levelers during the English Civil War. And even though the levelers were suppressed and democracy was dead in public discourse for probably 100 years, the democratic ideas survived in the English dissenting religions, but also in the colonies in the United States. So democracy was kind of an underground movement in the Quakers, in all these dissenting religions, but they reemerged in the person of Tom Paine with common sense during the American Revolution, and then the spread of those democratic ideas because of that. Also Richard Price in England, who supported the revolt in the colonies against England. So that's the source of democratic thinking. And because I saw Lee neglect the centrality of democracy, I thought going back in history and kind of reviving the centrality of the democratic demand and then tracing its course through Marxism would be a way to emphasize the importance. And then, of course, it applied to the United States because we're not a democracy. So that was the thinking behind an alternative reading list to what the Marxist Unity Group had put together.
Yeah, what this reader does is it focuses, as you said, on that question of democracy. Where does the demand for universal and equal rights come from? Where does the demand for a state that would reflect universal and equal political rights, one person and one vote? Where does that come from? How does that develop? As you said, how does it go underground, or why does it go underground at various points? Then slowly but surely, as we advance in history, comes this demand for a democratic U.S. Constitution. And then we trace that going up to the present day and so on and so forth. One thing I also think about in terms of the title, thinking about the struggle for universal and equal rights, is the idea of where does that demand come from, but then also why we can make that sort of a center point of our language, of our slogan, when we're describing the need for universal and equal rights, or for a constitution based on one person, one equal vote. It's kind of, where does that language come from? Why can we use that language? Why is that language dangerous and not just bourgeois or reformist or so on and so forth? I think all that is there in the reader as well.
Oh, yeah. Look, the language of rights, which is the dominant language, let's just say for the history of the United States, it is the dominant language. It's how people talk about politics, particularly the right to vote. And it's just in the air. That's how we think. That's what our world is constructed of. The problem is Marx had a very distorted view of what rights were. And it just persists throughout Marxism. There's this suspicion of rights, that somehow socialism doesn't come from rights. Now the source of this in Marx, is his essay on the Jewish question, where he says, look, rights are just egoism and selfishness, okay? And that is just not true. Rights are reciprocal obligations in a social community. There was a major change in thinking during the French Revolution, because prior to the French Revolution, the notion of rights and property were a popular demand against the aristocracy, the king, and the church. That the thinking of it is you had to have your own individual secure property to be a free individual, to be free from domination. So that's why a right to property is in the Rights of Man and Citizen in the 1789. Well, what happens during the French Revolution, primarily as a product of supplying the French army with supplies, is concentrations of new wealth occur. New organizations, new capitalist organizations are formed. And then the people become aware that there is this new form of domination. And it's private property, but it's concentrated and monopolistic. And at that point, there's a change of thinking of both Tom Paine and Gracchus Babeuf, that the people they still have a right to property, but that property is now social and collective. It's no longer individual, and that the people and democracy then have to take control of these new forms of capitalist property. So there's a major change. But the notion of egalitarian rights and what it takes to be free, that's inherent in the notion of equal rights. And Marx gets it completely wrong. Completely wrong. Anyway, so that's another thing that the reading list tries to deal with, that problem and the misconceptions of the notion of equal rights.
Yeah, I find that point that you make really interesting, to think about how property relations change with the development, perhaps you could just say, of a more modern capitalist system. You have the concentration of private property that becomes, as you said, monopolistic, becomes a source of domination. And then the conception of, well, what would a liberatory democratic movement have to do with that property changes in a certain sense, that question of collective social ownership and control. And I suppose a little later on, into the 1830s, 1840s or so, you have discussions of, well, the working class as a social force that could do this. But at no point does that demand for a democratic republic go away. Even perhaps if Marx fudges these ideas of universal and equal rights, they still maintain this idea of, well, we would need a democratic state in order to win the battle for democracy, so on and so forth. So anyway, these are all things that the reader's exploring.
Yeah. Now, I mean, one thing I'll say is democratic rights never went away. They went away within Marx's head. They went away in some of his writings. But whenever Marx got involved in mass politics, he had to suppress his own theory. I mean, he has a letter to Engels, about the first, writing the rules of the First International, and said, I was forced to use the language of justice and rights. I presented them in such a way they will do no harm. But he couldn't get out of the mass thinking of how the workers conceptualized, how they themselves conceptualized what their struggle was. And again, in the effort program, there's a reaffirmation of equal rights. No rights without duties, no duties without rights. It's the language of the rights of man and citizen that Marxist theory could never expel, even though it wanted to, even though Marx and Engels wanted to. They couldn't do it. Now, it finally was expelled with the Bolshevik Revolution. And that's when the whole idea of bourgeois democracy, where the notion of the democratic republic was replaced in the programs of Marxist parties with the idea of the dictatorship of the party. And the democratic republic became bourgeois democracy. Now, democracy is not bourgeois. I mean, bourgeois has, what bourgeois means, right? It means a town dweller, and the town dwellers were in opposition to the feudal lords and all that back in medieval history and the development of capitalism. But the town dwellers were not a coherent, unified class. Town dwellers like Paris, in the French Revolution, was divided. There was a class division in the cities, okay? And it was the working class, the laboring class, the proletariat. They were the Democrats. The bourgeoisie has never been democratic. So again, all of these words, all of these conceptions, it's a long, complicated history, and it's still being unraveled. And I don't know if people really realize that. The works of Hal Draper, Richard Hunt, Neil Harding in the 1970s really took on all these categories coming from the 19th century into the 20th with the Bolshevik Revolution. How all these categories got mixed up and confused. and how Marxist history was written backwards. And so we still have to straighten all that out.
Yeah, that's definitely something the reader is trying to do too, is straighten out this history. It's a tall task. Really hone in on how words are used, definitions are used, not be too quick or just put a lot of attention into the phrases that are used. Because, for example, the term bourgeois democracy is thrown around a lot. I would hesitate to say that's sort of the primary way that the socialist left in the US at least understands or thinks about democracy as something called bourgeois democracy. And then also this question of is democracy a threat? Is democracy dangerous? Is it a threat to property, as we talk about in section 3? So all of these questions are things that the reader is also trying to grapple with. Turning to Lenin, we have Lenin come up in section 8, the tactics of democratic republicanism, Lenin on democratic consciousness. That's actually not the only place where Lenin comes up. We also read the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party's 1903 program. So what are you looking at when you look at Lenin and this question of democratic consciousness?
Well, I mean, that's where I learned about democratic consciousness. It's very specific institutional demand. So back in 1971, I had to write an article about the murder of George Jackson in San Quentin. And so someone suggested I read Lenin's article, The Drafting of 183 Students into the Army. Because that's an example where Lenin writes about what socialists and workers, what their attitude should be to non-working class resistance to oppression. And so I had read What Is to Be Done and, other major things by Lenin. And, you get the revolutionary sense from it. And, you get the big picture. But you don't get the sense of, well, how do you go about it? What are the tactics? So in this article, Lenin says, any worker who does not come to the aid of the students in their fight with the police is unworthy of the name socialist. Now, clearly, socialist does not mean an economic theory there. So what's going on? Well, Lenin, more than any other Marxist in history, emphasized the need to oppose oppression of any kind against anybody. And if you didn't do that, you were not a socialist. And that was kind of eye-opening for me. And so then I started reading in the first several volumes of his collected works, his agitational articles, his programmatic articles, his fight, against economism and revisionism. And so then What Is to Be Done in chapter 3, the working class as vanguard fighter for democracy. And so at that point, things just started clicking. And the program calling for a democratic republic and political agitation in the class point of view, talking about a democratic republic and the difference between proletarian democracy, and he does call it bourgeois democracy, but he also, the same distinction is the difference between a democratic republic and a constitutional republic with checks and balances. That's the proletarian bourgeois difference. It's in the structure of the institutions of the state. Anyway, so that was eye-opening. And then that's when I look at the U.S. state, right? And this is during Watergate, and the Senate is acting and doing things, and they're changing the filibuster rules. And it just then it kind of dawned on me that, okay, the structure of the U.S. state is undemocratic. It's not just the U.S. bourgeois democracy does undemocratic things. It's that it's not a democracy at all. Okay, and so that's the connection.
I think that point about structural democracy is really important. For example, the conversation I was having with someone that I think was sort of emblematic of others is I was talking with someone and saying, the U.S. isn't a democracy. And they were saying, oh, yeah, I agree. The U.S. isn't a democracy. You can't be a democratic country when you have this much wealth concentrated in so many hands, or when you have this particular economic system that we have. You can't call that a democracy, which I suppose in some ways is true, but it avoids or doesn't pick up on that question of the state and what the state structure is like. You can say the U.S. is not a democracy because we don't have a political system based on one person, one equal vote. And then there are various things that come out of that. For example, rights within the economic sphere, the concentration of wealth, so on and so forth. But there's even if well-intentioned, there's almost a reflexive aversion to looking at the political structure and kind of immediately going forward into the economy, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, there's a logic to this, right? That concentrations of wealth are incompatible with democracy. Absolutely true. That's just definitional, but it doesn't say anything about your strategy, your tactics, or the content of your agitation and the way to attack that wealth. And how is that wealth itself? How does it protect itself? Okay. Now, there are leftists, whether you communist, anarchist, I don't know, whatever you want to name, who basically says there is no transition period between now and the revolution to abolish property. You just say we want to abolish property and that's our goal. And we denounce capitalism. Well, that is not what Marx, Engels, or any of the, not orthodox, classical Marxists said. All of them knew that you can't have democracy with concentrations of wealth. But their specific strategy was to win the battle of democracy, to establish a democratic republic where you then use the state and laws to take control of the capitalist property. But it's not a simple mechanism. It's complicated for all kinds of reasons. The division between manual and intellectual labor, who has a monopoly on knowledge, all kinds of things, okay? That it's not simple. And that's the sections on the tactics of democratic republicanism, the three sections, Lenin, Luxemburg, Kautsky. That why winning the battle for democracy is the primary strategic goal of the classical Marxists. And now again, there are other socialists and anarchists who have disagreed with that since the beginning, right? And so Marxism is actually political socialism. And unfortunately, the way most people read Marxism is that they don't have a theory. They're not exposed to the theory of why Marxism was political in the first place, of how different Marx and Engels were, from Proudhon, Robert Owen, and going off and forming little socialist communities. Classical Marxism was political socialism, and politics meant the democratic republic.
Well, I think you bring up 2 points. One, the idea that Marx and Engels represented political socialism, that idea in of itself is important, though I was introduced to that before coming to discussions about the Democratic Republic and so on and so forth. And then to take it a step forward and say, well, the content of that politicalness, if you will, is the demand for the Democratic Republic. It's not just, well, Marxism is political socialism because, you run your socialist candidate for the presidency every X, Y, and Z years, or you engage in electoral campaigns to spread the good news of socialism or something like that. It's adding that democratic Republican content to the politicalness of it, and then putting that forward as a strategy. Because I think you're exactly right. That's what is missing in a lot of discussions is, well, what's a strategy to get these things? What's a strategy? For example, I was talking about Bernie Sanders, all the great things that Bernie Sanders wants, which are great things. How do you get those things? How can you imagine getting those things? Do you imagine getting those things through the undemocratic state and the undemocratic constitution? Or do you struggle for a democratic society in which you could imagine yourself winning the battle for those things? I wanted to ask about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, because we have several sections that tie in that struggle, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, Black Liberation, and the New Left. What do you take from King and the Civil Rights Movement?
Yeah, well, I'm actually writing an article on this right now for the Mug, Light, and Air blog. Now, I did not read much Martin Luther King. He was a great leader. I knew his public speeches, and his speech against the Vietnam War in 1967, where he completely separated himself from the Democratic Party and other civil rights leaders who thought the future of the struggle for Black equality was going to be in conjunction with the Democratic Party. He just blew that away. Okay, so that's the King I knew. And it's really only recently that I've gone back and read some of his books. And he is a much more radical thinker. Now, there have been a lot of articles, oh, King was a socialist, and that's what makes his thought radical. Well, and I don't think that's what made his thought radical. King was a radical because he was a radical democratic egalitarian, and he knew the Constitution was not democratic. Now, he didn't know where the movement was going. I mean, his last book was, Where Do We Go From Here? And he knew that economic issues and economic equality was beyond the Constitution because the Constitution protected property. And he was very knowledgeable about the social democratic programs of European countries. He read Marx, he read Capital, he knew what economic exploitation was all about. But he had a sense of what the rhythm of the mass movement was. And he was totally for integration into U.S. society on an equal basis. So he profoundly disagreed with Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X about any kind of separatism. It couldn't work. But he also didn't think it could work psychologically, morally, that it was just entirely in the wrong direction. That America was now home to black people. It was their home. And so his radicalness was the demand for equality. And I agree with that. I mean, and again, so I'm going to end the article I'm writing with King and Lenin, vanguard fighters for democracy, because their democratic thought is identical ideologically, at least the pre-1917 Lenin. Anyway, so I would urge everybody, go back and read King, his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, about the Montgomery struggle in 1958. And then I think the last book, Where Do We Go From Here? I think they're an education in themselves.
Yeah, I agree. Looking at King as a radical Democrat, someone who came to a really incisive and biting critique of what the U.S. was like, not only the consequences of its political system and the lack of democracy and various problems at home, but the causes for that. I'm not only seeing the consequences of the problem, but also the root of the problem. And then again, this is, I think, what the reader is trying to do. It's arguing for the radicality of the demand for equality and universal and equal rights, and saying that's perhaps the moral foundation, also the strategic foundation around which many other things revolve. Going through some of the topics in the reader, I wanted to ask you about the New Left, because in section 14, we talk about the civil rights and the Black liberation movement, and then the New Left. And you've written an article as well, a short book, if you will, close to 100 pages, about the SDS. So what did you take from the New Left?
Yeah, well, again, the slogan of SDS was for participatory democracy. But by that, they just meant that the American values of democracy were good, but the reality of American society was bad, and they wanted to close the gap. And so they came up with the slogan of participatory democracy as kind of a moral urging to be active, to do something about it. And again, that they got a lot of their ideas from C. Wright Mills. And, Mills was known for criticizing Marxism as kind of being reduced to a slogan of the workers know best. And he called that the labor metaphysic. Okay, so all of SDS people were socialists, but they didn't see that as the way to create activity at that point. Of course, again, they were supporters of the civil rights movement. They learned from SNCC and the civil rights movement. They did what they could prior to the Vietnam War in community organizing projects to build an interracial movement of the poor. But then the Vietnam War took over, and the framework completely changed to the opposition to U.S. imperialism. And then the progression, the New Left then started learning about Marxism again. The Vietnamese revolutionaries, the Chinese Revolution, Mao, Lin Biao, forget the title of his 1965 pamphlet of national liberation struggles surrounding the cities of the metropoles, long than the victory of People's War. That was kind of the thinking, that the crisis of imperialism would rebound against the U.S. and it would then generate struggle here. And so, I joined the Revolutionary Union, the biggest Marxist Marxist-Leninists is the wrong idea. That was their ideology, but they were not centralized. They just said, look, go get working class jobs, form collectives, and keep studying Marx and Lenin and Mao. And so I was in that milieu when I started reading Lenin. So then the idea started coming into conflict of democracy versus what? Another communist party, democratic centralist party? That's the direction that the new communist movement went. The problem is the Vietnam War ended, and the reciprocal action of national liberation struggles intensifying the struggles in the U.S., well, that driver stopped. Really started going down. And then the movement was on its own. It's, well, what do we do now? What do we do about this situation? And that's where I parted ways with all the party building movement, which I just thought was nonsense, just built on false premises. And that's when I switched to, well, we need a democracy in the US. That's where we should focus.
So I wanted to end by asking you about a description you gave me at one point about the blog, or what the blog should sort of aspire to be as a concentrated advocacy organization. What do you mean by a concentrated advocacy organization, and what should we really be trying to do at this point with the ideas that we have here in the reader?
Well, I mean, this goes back to my experience in SDS, but also some writings by Hal Draper. The left is always talking about organization. We've got to organize. We've got to get together. Organization is our only strength. But what they don't ask is, well, where does the energy come from for an organization? Well, I think ideology and strategy precedes organization. That organization condenses around a strategy. And so I'm familiar with the history of SDS, right? That just started with a handful of people. Basically, Al Haber on the University of Michigan campus in the 1950s, trying to figure out how did the world work. And he sensed from the civil rights movement that there's a democratic upsurge happening in this country. And it's not based on the old industrial unions. It's coming from somewhere else. And all they could do, again, Mills is the same. All you could do, you looked at who was moving. Well, it's blacks in the civil rights movement. There was the anti-Cold War movement in various shapes, against the, atom bomb, the Cold War. And then there were students, intellectuals in the university, really dissatisfied with the social theories and stuff that they were being taught. So there's just a dissatisfaction. But the point is that the movement formed around a relatively small core of ideology and activism. And so Hal Draper went in his own little world. Let me finish with SDS. SDS was never a consolidated organization. I mean, it had a national office that maybe a dozen people worked in. They put out a newspaper, but they were dependent on contributions from local SDS members and chapters. They didn't dispense anything, except orders for literature and speaking engagements. They were just an ideological leadership. They wrote things, and SDS conventions and the papers were just filled with all kinds of analyses, and the movement flowed from that. Now, Hal Draper in his own little world, the little socialist world, coming out of the free speech movement, the International Socialists, they wanted to become an organization, and Draper goes, you're all wrong. Don't try to rebuild these organizations. And he came up with this concept of ideological centers. He said, look, if you've got an idea, start out with a publication. Try to pull together a group of people who agree with your ideas and put out your publication. And don't try to tie that directly to running a political organization. Let local people, wherever they are, read all this stuff, make their own choices about tactics. So the idea that a center can dictate tactics, that was the main rejection of both Draper and SDS. It's like only people on the ground know what's going on. We can do broad ideological stuff, so take war research on the campuses. Okay, so the SDS national office would put out stuff on that research, Columbia Institute for Defense Analysis. But it was the Columbia chapter that took that and did sit-ins. And we did the same thing at Princeton. There was a computer center for IDA. Okay, and we do sit-ins there. But it was the local people who took the ideology and then tried to find activity behind it. Anyway, so that's what I mean by a concentrated ideological expression, trying to pinpoint where we think we should concentrate.